Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Moed Katan Kaf Aleph. This month's shiurim are dedicated by Ruth Rotenberg in loving memory of her daughter Taniel Miller, Aleh Shalom, on her 17th year at site, and David Ze'ev Rotenberg on his recent passing. Today we celebrate and commemorate Taniel's short and powerful life. She loved learning Israel and doing chesed. We're grateful to family and friends who have shared how they bring Taniel's essence into their lives as an inspiration. David Ze'ev Rotenberg exuded warmth and love and was so proud of living in Israel with his family around him. Thank you to Rabbanit Michelle for making Daf so inspiring and meaningful on a daily basis. This month's shiurim are also dedicated by Sharon Bartel and David Form in honor of their daughter Mia's bat mitzvah and her siyum of Seder Moed. We are so proud of you and are impressed by your amazing accomplishment. Thank you for giving your family and friends something wonderful to celebrate. Okay, we are going to start at the bottom of Kaf Amud Bet. We were in the middle of, and I should just mention right now, the Siyum, Ezrat Hashem, we're going to do next Thursday. The Siyum is going to be at 7 o'clock Israel time. It's a little bit earlier because we're going to do the Hebrew and the English on the same night. Changing from last time we kind of pushed it off a few days. We decided to try it this time on the day of. So Thursday, which is the day that we finish the Masechet. Again, as usual, there'll be no shiur in the morning, but there will be shiur at night. We'll learn the last daf together. We have Rabbanit Nechama Barish with us, and Farber, one of our learners, who I'm looking at right now, will be speaking also. So looking forward to seeing you all there on Zoom. The registration should go up today. Okay. A Meimar. We had a Meimar at the end of yesterday's daf, where he started tearing Kriya for his grandson, and then he realized, oh wait, I'm not supposed to do it until I see my son, because remember, it's all out of respect for his son. Then he tears Kriya when he sees his son, but then he realizes, oh wait, I did it while I was sitting, not while I was standing. So then he realizes he does it standing. To which Rav Ashi says to him, Kriya de me'umad minalan, where are you getting it from? And he says, Dichtiv, are you learning it from Vayakam Eov, Vayikat Milo? Eov stood up and tore his cloak. This is in the beginning of Sefer Eov. We know all these tragedies befall him, his family, they all die, and then he tears Kriya. And it says Vayakam, meaning he stood up. But it says, Rav Ashi Tameimar, if that's your proof, Elameata, Va'amad va'amar lo chafatzi lekachta. Another time it says standing up, okay? Vayakam is to stand up, and Amad is to stand up. Same thing. So it says in the Torah, in Sefer Dvarim, when it talks about the tekes, the ceremony of chalitza, which we'll get to in Masechet Yevamot, which is coming up soon, it says, if he doesn't want to marry the brother when the brother dies without children, and the brother is supposed to marry the wife in order to hakim shem hamet, to perpetuate the name of his brother, but he doesn't want to marry her. So he stands up and it says, Ba'amad va'amal, which literally means he stands up and says, Lo chafatzi lekachta, I'm not interested in marrying her. And then they do this ceremony called chalitza. We'll learn all about it when we get there. But the point is, do you want to say there he literally has to stand up when he makes that statement? It's not true. If you want to say hachanami, also here, well, v'hatanya, says in a braita, bein yoshev, bein omei, bein muteh. He could be in any position. He could be sitting. He could be standing. He could be lying down when he says this. It doesn't make a difference. So here you see, if you're going to take Eov literally, Vayakam, then you'd have to take Chalitza literally, V'amad. And we don't take it literally, so therefore we shouldn't take Eov literally and mean that Eov specifically stood because, right, it doesn't make any sense. So Amarle, Hatam lo ktiv Vayamod Vayomar. It doesn't say there, in the form Vaya'amod, right? Va'amad is usually past tense, and Vaya'amod is future. Vaya'amod, and he should stand and he should say. If it said Vaya'amod, it would be clear that he needs to be standing. But because it says Va'amad, it's not just say, get up and go. Get up and go doesn't mean necessarily stand up. It just, like, to get up, sometimes it's just to get moving. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be standing up when you do it. Right? The word va'amad here isn't in the form that means definitely stand up. Amar va'amar. In fact, I looked it up. I wanted to see I looked in Safaria, the English. I think it says something like he insists and he says, okay, meaning va'amad just means he stands on his word, maybe something like that. It doesn't mean literally stand up. Again, that's all translation. I'm sure if you look in different chumashim, it's translated in different ways. So whereas by Eov, it actually, I think it said he stood and he tore Kriya. So anyway, so they make this distinction. Whether or not this distinction is actually true, I'll give you another example where vayakam doesn't mean to stand up. Vayakam kayin al hevel achiv. when Cain gets up and stands up against his brother and kills him. So it says vayakam, he stood up, but it didn't mean literally he stood up. It means he went up against his brother and he killed him. So vayakam doesn't always literally mean stand up, but they assume here there's a difference between va'amad and vayakam. Okay, and if it said vaya'amod. Amarami Barchama. So the first answer we basically have is we learned it from Eov. Even though we tried to bring a question against it from Chalitza, we end up with Eov. Rami Barchama also learns it from Eov. How do we know you have to stand when you tear kriya? As it says, Vayacham Eov vayikha. Again, same verse. Dilma, the Gemara says, wait a minute. When Rami Barchama said it, they asked a question. Maybe he did something beyond the letter of the law. Okay, sometimes people do things additional that they didn't really need to do. It's, yes, he stood, but it doesn't mean that we have to stand. And how do we know this? Also, it says in the same verse, he shaved his head off. Now, generally, first of all, it's actually a problem to do this. First of all, you're not supposed to cut your hair when you're in Avelut. And not only that, but you're not allowed to tear out your hair out of being upset for a mate. So it's a little bit weird that Eov did this. But besides that, he did this almost against the law, but he certainly didn't do it because the law said he was supposed to do it. So therefore, the fact that he stood up and tore kriya really doesn't mean anything at this point, because he also shaved off his hair, which certainly isn't what the law says. So therefore, elamehacha. So it must be from some other verse. So the Gemara brings a different verse. Vayakam hamelech vayikat begadav. This is David HaMelech. Who is he mourning for? In the story with David and Avshalom, a messenger comes and tells David that Avshalom has killed all of David's sons. Now, it ends up not being true. He only killed Amnon. But at that point, David thinks that he killed all of his sons. And David's immediate reaction is, Vayakam hamelech, sounds like he stood up, Vayikat begadav, and he tore his clothes. So there you see, you have to stand up. So again, we're going to learn it from some character in the Tanakh who stands up and tore his clothes. Must be, that's the halacha. To which again, the Gemara says, how do we know that because, right, just because somebody does something doesn't mean that everyone else has to do it. Maybe he did something additional. Maybe he could have sat and tore kriya. He stood, but that doesn't mean we need to. And how do we know that he must have done something extra? Because what else does he do? If you don't say that, it says he lied down on the ground. Now, we learned before that an Avel needs to turn over their bed, right? And we know also Avelim sit close to the ground, but they don't need to sit actually on the floor. And in fact, Vahatanya, it says in a Braita, Yashav al gabe mita, al gabe kiseh, al gabe udyani, whether it's gdola or not, but if you sit on a bed, or you sit on a chair, or you sit on a pestle, I don't know why you would sit on it, but a big pestle, something else, lo yatsa yedei chovato. You don't fulfill your obligation. What obligation are we talking about? So comes Rabbi Yochanan to explain this Braita. Sorry, the mortar. I sometimes confuse those terms. My mistake. Yeah, obviously the pestle is the stick. This happens when you're teaching at a fast pace. It's the mortar that I was thinking about that he sat on, not the pestle. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan shelo kiyem kfiyat mital. Rabbi Yochanan comes and says he wasn't doing the mitzvah of kfiyat mital. In other words, what comes out of here is if you sit on the ground, it's very nice. You're sitting on the ground. You're supposed to be low, right? You're supposed to be uncomfortable, but that's not actually the purpose of the mitzvah of kfiyat mitah. Kfiyat mitah is this idea that you're supposed to turn over the bed. And if you remember, we saw before that what's the idea? That God says, I made you in my image, and you, right, this person who died, turned it over, right, in his sins. Again, this is assuming whoever dies is dying on account of their sins, but you're supposed to turn over your bed as a symbolic act of that things are not the way they're supposed to be. So you don't accomplish that by lying on the floor. So if that's the case, what he's saying is that when David lied down on the ground, he was also doing something not within the halacha. Yes, it might be a nice thing he did, to kind of make himself super uncomfortable, but that's not what he was supposed to do. What he was supposed to do is to turn over the bed, and that's the halacha. What he was doing was maybe beyond the halacha, maybe not even within the frame of halacha, but the point is that maybe when he stood up also, it wasn't necessarily halacha. To which the Gemara this time has an answer. Amarle ke'ein arza. Now, it could be he turned over the bed and he was actually sitting on the bed. Why did it say arza? Because it said he was like being on the ground because he turned over his bed and then he was lowered to the ground and it was like he was lying on the ground, but he wasn't actually lying on the ground, in which case he was within the halacha of what was required, which would then mean that when he stood up to tear kriya, he was within halacha, and there you have your source. Okay, so we end up with a source that does teach that kriya has to be done standing. Tanu Rabbanam. We're now going to quote a braita. Basically, for the rest of today's daf, we're going to quote a lot of braitot and deal with them, sometimes with contradictions within them, sometimes just learning halachot from them. Elu dvarim she'avel asur bahen. These are the things that someone who's in mourning is not allowed to do. Asur b'melacha, can't do work. Uberichitza, washing. Ubesicha, anointing, putting on oils, creams. Ubetashmish amita, having sexual relations. Ubenilata sandal, and putting on shoes. Okay, this is very much like Yom Kippur, other than eating and drinking, which is not allowed on Yom Kippur, but is allowed in Avel. Ve'asur likot, and the melacha is obviously different melacha, right? Melacha, again, it's like the Chol Hamoed melacha, as opposed to the holiday melacha that you can't do. Ve'asur likot b'Torah b'nevi'im u'b'ktuvim. Now we get something additional, which actually is true for Tisha B'Av, but not for Yom Kippur. You can't learn Torah, Nevi'im, Ktuvim, anything in Tanakh. You can't lishnop a mishnah b'midrash halachot u'b'shas u'b'agadot, any kind of learning, okay? Not mishnah, midrash, halachas, shas. Okay, what shas is here is a good question, right? Because it kind of should be included already, mishnah and whatever, but shas is obviously more what we call Gemara, is probably what they're calling shas here, and agadot, okay? All that stuff you can't learn, except there's one big exception. If he was needed by many people, meaning, let's say, the big Rav in the city is sitting Shiva. Okay, we don't really do this nowadays, but according to this Braita, if the big rabbi was sitting Shiva, he would be able to teach, because if that's what people need, right? I guess you'd have to assume there's no one else to teach the drasha. If you have no one else to teach, then he can teach even though he's an Aval, which obviously raises a whole bunch of questions, which is, if the rabbi's teaching, people are going to think, while he's sitting in the Torah, he's sitting Shiva, people are going to think maybe that it's okay to learn Torah. So it's a little bit of an issue. We'll see this in a minute. But right now, it seems to say, if you're needed, you're allowed to teach even while you're sitting Shiva. U'ma'aseh, in case you didn't believe it, the Braita brings a case. Ma'aseh umet b'no shel Rabbi Yossi b'Tzipoli. Okay, Rabbi Yossi, his son died in Tzipoli. V'nichnas lebeit hamidrash v'darash kol hayom kulo. He went to the Beit Midrash and taught all day long, right? Hard to imagine. And now, in case that wasn't enough, they're going to bring a story of an Emorah that did the same thing. Rabba Bar Chana, Itraye Milta. So we're forward Tanaim generation. Now we're moving to the Emoraim. Something bad happened to him. That's a euphemism for saying someone died in his family. And Savar Delo Lemefak Lapirka. He thought not to go to the Shiur. Amarle Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina quotes him from this Braita and says, Ima yu rabim tzrichim lo eino nimna. So listen, they need you. You got to go to give the Shiur. Savar leukme morale. So he said, okay, fine. I need to go to the Shiur because I have to teach. So we figured, now, how did they do shiurim in those days? Not like we do shiurim now. Okay, now, right, somebody gets up in front of a room or gets up in front of Zoom or teaches. In those days, they had what was called an Emorah or a mature Geman. They're really synonymous. Okay, we know Emorah from the rabbis of the time of the Amoraim. But when they talk about it in this context, what they mean is the teacher would say what he wanted to teach, and someone else would project that to everybody else, okay? Whether he said it and the people close to him heard, and then the Emorah would project it to the people that were farther away because it was a big room, right? They didn't have microphones. Or perhaps he needed someone to, we know sometimes there's people who are brilliant, but people don't understand everything. So maybe that's why they're called the matur Gemam. Maybe they translate it a little bit so that people can understand it better. Okay, what exactly the reality is, nobody really knows because it was a long time ago and we don't have great evidence, but it was some form of either microphone or translation for the people. So he said, okay, if I need to teach, well, I'll teach in the way I normally teach, which is, let's get an Emorah to work with me. But Amar le Rav said to him, Tanya, it says in a Braita about what we just were talking about, Ubilvad shelo yamid tor geman. You can't do it. This reminds us of many things we saw until now, that sometimes you have to change from your normal way, right? We had this all Chol Hamoed stuff, and we had it way back in Shabbat. That sometimes you have to do things in an atypical manner. And this relates to what I said before, that people are going to see and think, that you can learn. So you have to do something different so that people understand. Yes, you're in Avelut, but you're going to teach anyway. But that's only because this is an exception to the rule. And by doing it differently, it will be obvious to everybody. So now the Gemara says, well, there was an assumption that people can't teach without a Matorgaman. So they say, Alahei Chiyavid. And now I feel like you're going to have a big game of broken telephone, okay? So how would they do it? They don't seem to be worried about that, but I'm a little worried. In order to prove what you're supposed to do, they bring a story of Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli, who's usually known to us as just Rabbi Yehuda. He's the famous Rabbi Yehuda who appears in all the Mishnayot, right? Just to remind you, when you see Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, it's not Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. You would think that. Yehuda HaNasi who put together the Mishnah. No. You see Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, it comes as Rebbe. When you see Rabbi Yehuda, that's Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eli. So his son died. We're going to see a lot of sons dying today, okay? And a lot of stories of people having their sons die. He comes into the Beit HaMidrash. Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya v'yashav b'tzido. So Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya sits right next to him. V'lachash hu Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya. He basically whispers to Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya what he wants to say. Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya letorgeman. Then Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya, this is why it seems like broken telephone, right? You got to hope that by the time the Matorgaman said what he said, he actually had it right, didn't make any mistakes. B'torgaman ishmiya leRabim. And he's the one who then made everybody, right? He announced it to everybody else. So from here you see that it has to be done with some sort of change. Okay, new Braita. As I told you, we're going to go from Braita to Braita today. Tanu Rabbanan. Again, Braita is Tanaitic material that did not make it into the Mishnah or into the Tosefta. Avel, that's our topic, a mourner. We're now going to have, until now we know, everybody knows there's Shiva, a week of sitting Shiva, right? There's Onain before that, which is while you're dealing with the dead body. We're not really talking about that so much now. Then there's Shiva. Then there's Shloshim, 30 days. We've learned all about this. And then there's a year, which we haven't really seen. We'll see that today. And there's a year that's generally for one's parents, right? There's no year for other people you're mourning for. Now we're going to start to see that even within the Shiva, there's a difference between the first day, which if you remember, when we talked about, is it Doraita, right? Is there Avelut from the Torah? And some people say maybe the first day you're Avel from the Torah, maybe the other day is not. There's often a distinction made between day number one. And also we're going to see the first 3 days. We saw this already. Remember our Mishnah that talked about the opinion that we don't hold by, that you need 3 days minimum of Avelut before a holiday for the holiday to come and cancel Shiva. And we don't hold this way, but we did see that the Mishnah said that. So you see something about the first 3 days, there's some significance to them. You see a lot of Braita about this. So the first 3 days, you can't wear tefillin. Okay, this is not what we do. We'll get to what we do soon. Mishlishi va'elach, ushlishi bichlal, mutar laniach tefillin. From the third day, including the third day. So even though it says 3 days, no. Well, the third day, what do we say? Miktzadayon kikulo. As soon as a little bit of the morning passes, you can already put on tefillin because it's as if you finished your first 3 days, even though you didn't. Bimbal panim chadashot. This is interesting. What are panim chadashot? This is someone who wasn't at the funeral. Why is it interesting? Because panim chadashot we normally know from a wedding. This is when you do sheva brachot. You always invite someone who wasn't at the wedding because then you can say sheva brachot. You can only say the sheva brachot if there were panim chadashot. The same thing is going to exist by Avelut. Okay, in general, we keep comparing a little bit to weddings, simcha versus Avelut. And we'll see this even much more so when we get to Masechet Ketubot, B'ezrat Hashem, in a few months. If new people came that weren't at the funeral and they don't know what day the person died exactly, they might not know that you're in day number 3. So maybe you'd have to take off your tefillin so it doesn't look like you're wearing tefillin within the first 3 days. But no, comes Rabbi Eliezer and he says, we'll see in a second, this is Rabbi Eliezer, you don't have to take your tefillin off. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So basically, first 3 days you don't wear tefillin. Third day already after the bit of the morning passes, you put on your tefillin. If someone new comes at that point, it doesn't matter. You don't have to take your tefillin off. Rabbi Yoshua, he disagrees about both points. The first 2 days you can't. Already on day number 2, once a little bit of the morning passes, you can already wear tefillin. And if new people show up, though, that haven't seen you before, that weren't at the funeral, then you have to take your tefillin off because you don't want them to think that the funeral was today and you're wearing your tefillin. Okay, nowadays we hold like Rabbi Yoshua that you wear tefillin already on day number 2. And even if, I believe, I hope I'm getting this right, if the funeral is not on the day of the burial, then already it's only the day of the burial that you don't wear tefillin. But if the funeral is the day after, if the burial is the day after the person died, it's only the day the person died that you don't wear. The burial is the day after, then I believe you wear tefillin later in the day after the burial. Okay, so now what do we see here? Amar of Matna, we now want to know what are the reasons why I say wear tefillin on day number 3 or wear tefillin on day number 2. My time de Rabbi Eliezer dichtiv vayitmu yimei bechi evel Moshe. Okay, what does it say here? They finished the days of crying for Moshe. Now, how many days of crying were there? We're going to assume right now, even though actually they cried for him for 30 days, but they're going to say here yimei bechi. They're going to say days of crying. That means days plural 2, minimum 2. There must be at least 2 days of crying. That means you're not going to wear tefillin. By the way, I just should remind you, the whole reason we learned that you don't wear tefillin was because of Yechezkel. Remember, it says, we learn all these things from Yechezkel. Whatever he did he wasn't allowed to do laws of mourning. And he had to put on his pe'er, his glory, which was his tefillin. And it's not appropriate when you're sitting Shiva to wear things that glorify you, make you look beautiful. So now, how many days though? Just while you're really crying. So how long is that? So they say minimum 2 days. Amar Rav Eina, my time of Rabbi Yoshua. This is a verse from Amos. We saw this verse before, where it said, "V'hafachti chagechem le'evel." From there, we learned that Avelud is 7 days, and it says, "Acharita ki yom mar." Okay, in the end, it's like one real bitter day. So I say one real bitter day. There's only one bitter day, not yemei bechi. So now that gets you to only 1 day you shouldn't wear tefillin. For Rabbi Yeshua Nami, now we're going to have to figure out what does each one do with the other verse. Shua Nami haktiv vayitmu yemei v'gomer. Amar lecha shani Moshe detakif evle. Moshe, but you're comparing everybody else to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, there were more days of crying than for anybody else. That doesn't mean that that's applicable to the rest of us. So now we ignore that pasuk according to him. What do we do with Rabbi Eliezer, Nami Haktiv Acharita Ki Yomar, which seems like it's one real bitter day, and then only 1 day you shouldn't wear tefillin? Ikar Meri Rachad Yom. That has to do with the bitterness, the way you feel, the bitter feeling, the horrible, right, feeling you have when you're sitting Shiva. Is that worst feeling is on day number 1. But that has nothing to do with the law of whether you wear tefillin or not. That's describing the state of mind of a person. That doesn't connect with the law of tefillin. So he basically puts that pasuk aside for these purposes. Now the question becomes, how do we hold? Okay, I'm going to get back to, because the Gemara doesn't address this, but there are some commentaries that do, which is why tefillin is different from learning Torah, right? If you think about it, learning Torah, you can't do all week. Tefillin, we only reserve to, right? It's either forbidden 1 day or 2 days, depending on which opinion you hold by, but it's very different than learning Torah. We'll get back to that when we finish this section. Amar Ula. So now we're going to get to how do we paskin. Halacha ke Rabbi Eliezer b'chalitza, v'halacha ke Rabbi Yeshua b'hanacha. Don't confuse chalitza with, we talked about it in the beginning of the page, about chalitza, yibum chalitza. No. Here we're talking about, what do we learn in this braita? About taking off your tefillin. Lachlotz is to take off. Taking off your tefillin, which is, by the way, similar to the chalitza ceremony. It's taking off your responsibility of, you're supposed to take care of your husband's wife. You're relinquishing yourself from responsibility. So it's the same idea. So now, there were 2 issues they debated. One is, what day do you wear tefillin? Number 2, if after that day, right, where you're supposed to be wearing tefillin, but you see someone who doesn't know what day the burial was, do you have to take your tefillin off? So Rabbi Eliezer had said, you need to wear tefillin for the first 3 days, right? Really only 2 in the end, but the first 3 days, you don't wear tefillin. Again, after the beginning of the morning of day number 3, you would, as opposed to Rabbi Yoshua, who said 2 days. Then he said, though, but if you see someone, right, someone who new comes, you don't have to take off your tefillin, okay? Once you're allowed to wear tefillin, you don't have to take them off. So what does he say? I hold like Rabbi Eliezer b'chalitza, that you don't have to take your tefillin off, but halacha ke Rabbi Yeshua b'hanacha, but I hold like Rabbi Yeshua that already after day number 1, right, on day 2, after a bit of the morning passes, yes, you wear tefillin. So now the question of the Gemara comes like this. So now you do take off your tefillin if new people come. I'm sorry, you don't take off your tefillin if new people come, but you put on your tefillin from day 2 and not from day 3. Now, nobody actually held that on day number 2, if you put on your tefillin, you wouldn't have to take them off, because Rabbi Eliezer didn't think you put on tefillin. And Rabbi Yeshua thought you put on tefillin, thought that you actually had to take them off. So the question becomes, even though he holds like Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Eliezer about chalitza and Rabbi Yeshua about hanacha, when he says you don't have to take your tefillin off, and he held like Rabbi Eliezer in that way, Rabbi Eliezer only said that about day number 3. What about day number 2? Do we combine the 2 and come up with some new approach, which is on day number 2, you also, number 1, put on tefillin like Rabbi Yeshua and like Rabbi Eliezer. You don't have to take them off if somebody new shows up or not. So Tashma, let's learn from here. Amar Ula. Ula himself said in a different place, you take them off and you put them on even 100 times. Now, obviously, if Ula held like Rabbi Eliezer B'chalitza, who said you don't need to take them off, and yet he said here you have to take them off up to 100 times, he obviously is referring to day number 2. In which case, if it was day number 2, even Rabbi Eliezer would say, even Ula would say, even though I hold like Rabbi Eliezer, you don't have to take them off. You specifically do have to take them off every time new people come in, just on day number 2. Once day number 3 hits, then already you don't have to take them off. Tanya Namihachi, there's also a brighter to prove this. You would have been there. It doesn't say on day number 2, but we're assuming they're referring to day number 2. Rava disagrees with Ula. He says, once you're already allowed to put tefillin on, you don't have to take it off just because someone comes in and might misinterpret, right? We have a bunch of these issues today of someone misinterpreting, which we already saw throughout the Masechah with Chol Moed. Now we're seeing it with Avelut. He says, you don't have to take them off. Once you can wear tefillin, you can wear tefillin. You don't have to worry that someone shows up and thinks that you buried the person today. You don't have to worry about that. Wait a minute. What Rava is basically saying is, on day number 2 already, you wear tefillin and you don't have to take them off, even if new people come. But Rava himself, we saw this yesterday, Rava himself held that when it comes to a different issue, okay, it's an entirely different issue, but you'll see in a minute how they compare them. When it comes to, does the Regal cancel Shiva? Remember, the Mishnah had said, Regal only cancels Shiva if you've already sat for 3 days. Less than 3 days, no. So there Rava holds like the Tana of our Mishnah, and not like we hold, which is even 1 hour, the Regal cancels, the holiday cancels Shiva. But here we're going to say if Rava holds that you need that 3-day segment, and without that, your Shiva is not canceled, right? You finish up your Shiva after the holiday, then he theoretically should hold that tefillin up until the first 3 days has a different status. And he doesn't hold that. Right? He seems to hold already day number 2, you wear tefillin and you never have to take them off. So because of that, they're saying that doesn't jive with what Rava says. So to which the Gemara answers, we're now moving to Amud Bet, mitzvah shane. When it comes to, does the Regal cancel Avelut, we need 3 days minimum. But when it comes to tefillin and not doing the mitzvah of tefillin, you think about tefillin, right? People always talk about tefillin. This is right? Something super basic to Judaism is wearing tefillin every day. So when you're in Avel, you're not going to wear tefillin for a whole week or 3 days or something. So no. There's a mitzvah to wear tefillin. And therefore, that's going to override even the 3 days of Shiva. Okay. We have this pasuk in Yechezkel. We can't get around it. We're going to learn from there. You can't wear tefillin, but we're going to minimize that as much as possible because it's a mitzvah. Now, here's where I want to get into Talmud Torah. What about the mitzvah of Talmud Torah? And we basically, right, anyone, I know in this group, there's been people who've sat Shiva during learning Daf Yomi. It's a big problem because you get behind 7 days, right? You can't learn Daf Yomi. You're really in trouble. But in general, there's a mitzvah to learn Torah. So why can't you learn Torah during Avelut? If we say mitzvah shane. So why don't we say that overrides? So there's a few different answers given. One answer is that there's a difference between the mitzvah of, and what's the issue with Talmud Torah? Why can't you do it when you're in Avel? Because learning Torah brings you happiness. And therefore, we don't want you to have that happiness during your week of Shiva. And that you don't get from wearing tefillin. Tefillin is not an activity that gives you happiness. It's something else. It's pe'er. It's glorifying God. connecting to God, but it's not this feeling of simcha, which negates avelut. That's one option. Another, I think, better option, because it's a little hard to say, maybe someone doesn't bring him simcha. It's hard to know. Another answer is that there's other ways to fulfill Tomotora. You can't fulfill tefillin in the mitzvah of tefillin without wearing tefillin, but you can fulfill the mitzvah of Tomotora without sitting and learning, daf yomi or whatever it might be. How's that? Well, there's a famous Gemara that talks about, you have to learn Torah day and night. So how do you fulfill that obligation? Does that mean you have to learn Torah all the time? So according to the minimalist opinion, all you have to do is say Shema in the morning, Shema at night, and you'll fulfill your obligation. So in Avel, we don't tell him, don't say Shema, right? In Avel davens in the morning and at night, and therefore fulfills his obligation through Kriyat Shema. So therefore, you can already fulfill that obligation in some other way. So you just don't do it in a more intensive manner. Okay. And therefore you hold by, minority opinion or one opinion that does give you a way to do it. And therefore you fulfill your obligation in that way. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan. Yes. And they learn Mishnayot, right? There are certain ways that they do it. They do learn Mishnayot we do that generally also during a lot of people between Mechamarv, learn Mishnayot. There's ways to do it in a simpler manner, whereas tefillin, there's no other way to do. Tanu Rabbanan. Avel, and this, by the way, yes, this is different. This is not onin. Onin is something else. Onin is you can't do mitzvot at all. That's while you're busy, and that's because you're busy dealing with the dead person, trying to bury them. You're exempt from all sorts of things. That's a whole different category that we're not discussing at all right now. Okay, another braita. Also, we're going to start all these braitot basically that are going to distinguish between 3 days, etc. The first 3 days you can't work at all. Even a poor person who's getting charity money and wants to work, I guess, instead of getting charity money, no, you can't work the first 3 days. But after the first 3 days already, we're going to be more lenient. You can do it in your house quietly so nobody sees. There's a big question about whether this Isha, this woman, is only a poor woman or this is any woman. And it could be that they're saying that any kind of, when you spin your thread in your house, that's something tsanua, that's something that you can do anytime. Maybe some people say it's not permanent work. It's like something you just do here and there, and it's not an issue. So either whether we're making a special dispensation for women who are impoverished or we're talking about any women at all. Tanu Rabbanan. Next bright. You can't go to someone else's Shiva. You have to stay at home. After the first 3 days, okay, so first of all, you can leave your house at that point, even though generally nowadays we don't leave the house at all, Avelim. But here there was a dispensation. You could leave your house to go to another Shiva house. And there are certain circumstances where people do leave their house during Shiva. But if you go to a Shiva house, you don't sit with the people who are consoling the person. You go sit with the people who are sitting Shiva. I'm trying to imagine the scene, right? It's hard to imagine. You would go to someone's Shiva and you would basically sit on the floor with them because you're also sitting Shiva. It's a little bit strange. It's almost like you're barging in on their territory. And we don't really do this anymore. The Rama even writes that this is not customary to do. But anyway, that's what it says here in this bright. But you see, by the way, we've seen this a bunch of times, that things that were happening at a certain point with Avelut, sometimes a lot of the customs changed. Just a lot of this is custom based. Tanu Rabbanan, another bright. You can't ask people, how are you? Okay, when you're sitting Shiva, you don't greet people and say, hi, how are you? They're not supposed to greet you either. We're going to talk about this now. So the first 3 days, you can't ask anybody how they're doing. And obviously, if somebody asks you how you're doing, you're not supposed to answer them either. Mishlosha ad Shiva, from the 3rd day to the 7th day, meshiv ve'eno shoel. If someone says, how are you? You can answer them. Okay, they're not supposed to, but if they do, you can answer them. But you can't say, how are you to them? Mikam ve'elach, from there on, after 7 days, shoel meshiv kedarko. At that point, you can say hello, you can respond, you can say, how are you? People can ask you how you are. After 7 days, it's all over. Although we'll see later in a braita that not everybody agrees with this. Okay, this braita, we're going to have a contradiction between this and another braita. Okay, the first 3 days, you can't ask people how they are. The Hatanya, wait a minute. This braita that says they did. Who? None other than Rabbi Akiva. You can read flashback today about more details about the story in Rabbi Akiva in general. Maaseh umetu banav shel Rabbi Akiva. Okay, there was a case, right? If you don't know, Flashback is written by Shuli Mishkin. It's found on Hadron's website. It's kind of a history perspective, historic stuff from the daf from the perspective of history. So, Amad, what happened? Maseu meitu banav shel Rabbi Akiva. You think about Rabbi Akiva, and you always think he had a tragic end to his life. Here you see his sons. There's different versions of the story, whether it was one son or two sons died. Right? It says banav, but some people say it's really bano. His sons died. Nichne or son. Nichnesu kol Yisrael v'espidum esbei gadol. Okay, it's Rabbi Akiva. Huge crowd came to eulogize him, to come to the funeral. Bishat ptiratan, when Rabbi Akiva stood to leave their presence, amad Rabbi Akiva al safsal gadol v'amar. Or when they were ready to go home, he got up on a big bench and he said, Achenu Beit Yisrael shimu, my brothers, listen. Afilu shnei banim chatanim. If this situation had been worse and it had been two married sons who died, which either means it was only one son rather than two sons that died, or maybe his sons weren't married. And he's saying, even if it were married sons, which would have been worse, minuchamu b'shvil kavod shasitem. You did such kavod to them that they would have been, right? They would have gotten nichama, consolation from what you did for them. In other words, either you're coming for their sake, and you did a great job. If you came out of respect for me, well, hare kama akiva b'shuk. There's lots of people like me. I don't know why you all came out for me like this. But elakach amartem, it must be that you said the following. You didn't come for me personally. What you come for? I represent Torah because I'm a Torah scholar. And therefore, you must have said, Torat Elohav b'libo. Right? He has the Torah of God in his heart. And therefore, koshken shescharchem kaful. You are going to get rewarded doubly because you gave respect to God in addition to that. Right? By coming out, that was respect to God, to the Torah. Here's the main important reason why we brought this. Go to your houses in peace. That means he blessed them b'shalom. It's almost like saying, how are you? It's like she'elat shalom. He gave them a bracha. How could he have done that? It was the day he buried his son. So the answer, again, we're going to see this issue of respect. Kvod rabim shane. The respect for many people, for the rabbim, for the community, overrides this. Okay, so in the sense you're not supposed to, but since such a big crowd came and it was respect for the community, he was allowed to do it. Now we're going to go back to something else this Braita said and bring another contradiction. So first contradiction was, how did Rabbi Akiva give the people a bracha? We're going to distinguish that case. Next, from day number 3 to day number 7, you can respond to someone. If they ask you, how are you, you can answer. But you can't ask, how are you? Mikan ve'elach, from there on in, meaning from day 7 and on, shoel umeshiv kedarko, you can carry on a regular conversation. Uriminu, that contradicts the following Braita. Now we're going to read another Braita, which is going to contradict. Hamotzeet chavero avel. You bump into your friend, they're mourning. B'toch 30 yom, within 30 days, midaber imo tanchumim. So you talk about what happened, and I'm sorry for you, and etc. Ve'eno shoel b'shlomo. You still can't ask b'shlomo. Now that already contradicts, because we already said in the Braita, the first Braita, after 7 days. This says within the first 30 days, you can still, you're not allowed to ask him, how are you, or her. Lachar 30 yom, after 30 days, shoel b'shlomo, you can ask, how are you? And you shouldn't mention any more about the person who died. Meta ishto, this is already, we're off now. We already got to the contradiction that it's the cutoff is shloshim, and in the other one, the cutoff was Shiva. So now they say, if Meta ishto, his wife died, we're just quoting the rest of the Braita, he married someone else. If he got remarried, some people do that. They get married very quickly. You can't start talking to him about how you're doing with the loss of your wife. It's a little bit strange. He now has a new wife. So you shouldn't do that, right? Even if it's within shloshim. Meta mitza'oba shuk, but if you find him outside, not in his house, but his wife's not with him, you can ask him about his first wife. Just, do it gently, do it be careful with your words, with seriousness, but you can ask him. I'm Rav Idi Bravin. So now he's going to explain how do we deal with this contradiction. When it said after Shiva, you could do it. He can ask how other people are doing because they're shruyim b'shalom. They're okay. But achirim, when it said you can't do it, that's achirim and shoalim b'shlomo. But other people can't ask how he's doing because Shu'ei no sharoi b'shalom. Now we get to understand the reason why you can't do this. Because when you're in a really bad way and someone says, how are you? It's almost like, what do you mean, how am I? You know I'm miserable. I'm very upset. Why would you ask that question? It's not an appropriate question when you're in such a bad state, right? What are you going to say? And sometimes it's awkward at a Shiva, right? You start saying, how are you? What do you mean, how am I? Well, you know how I am. So you shouldn't do that even up to 30 days. But if I'm the mourner, I can ask you how you're doing. Okay, that's allowed because you're okay. You're not in a miserable state like I am. So that's how they resolve the contradiction. Next, Vahami de Katani Meshiv, but wait. But then it says you can respond to people. So Michlal de Shailin Ale, if you're going to say the whole distinction is can people ask him or can he ask people? Or people ask her, she can ask people. It sounds like no one can ask, right? People can't ask her at all. So now it says though, Meshiv, you can respond. You just can't ask. So if you're responding, it sounds like people can ask you. So they say de lo yade. No, we're talking about people who don't know that they're not supposed to ask you. This happens all the time. Go to a Shiva house. Many people say, hi, how are you? But really you're not supposed to, but they don't know that. So if they ask, then what did the Braita say? If it's the first 3 days, you don't, right? But if it's the 3rd to 7, then you can respond. So again, responding is only if someone accidentally asked you, not if they purposely asked you, because they're not supposed to purposely ask you. Okay, only if they didn't know. So then they say, wait a minute. If someone accidentally asks you, the halacha is you're supposed to respond to them. So why distinguish first 3 days where you can't respond to them and 3rd to 7 where you can respond to them? That's the next question. Also in the beginning, you should be able to respond to them. The first 3 days. I say no. We're going to distinguish. What's the distinction? Hatam, the first 3 days, modeluhu v'lo mahadruhu. You have to basically not respond to him and you have to tell him you're not, or her, whoever asks you, how are you? You're supposed to say, you're not supposed to ask me that. But hacha, after 3 days already, lo tzarich lo dinu, you don't have to say, listen, you shouldn't have said that. Then you just respond. It's okay. You can respond to them if they asked you. Urim minhi, another contradiction. So the first contradiction we brought another Braita and used that to contradict. And that Braita distinguished between before the achar shloshim yom, it's right, betoch shloshim yom, within the first 30 days to after the next 30 days. And it said that after 30 days, what did it say? Shoel b'shlomo ve'eino medaber imo tanchumim. You can ask how they're doing normally, and you can't start mentioning the person who died. But that's going to contradict another Braita. So now we're up to Braita 3 here. Uriminu, hamotzeet chavero avel betoch 12 chodesh, medaber imo tanchumim ve'eino shoel b'shlomo. Here it says the cutoff is not shloshim, the cutoff is a year. Before a year, you can still talk to them about the person who died, and you can't ask, how are you doing? La'achar 12 chodesh, after 12 months, shoel b'shlomo ve'eino medaber imo tanchumim. After 12 months, then you can ask how they're doing, and you can't mention the person who died anymore. The only thing you could do is sort of allude to it, not directly. Rabbi Meir, so Rabbi Meir wants to explain why this is. After 12 months, what do you like? If you start, after 12 months, you start asking how you're doing about the loss of your father. Okay? So, what's this like? It's like a person, someone broke his leg and his leg healed. He bumps into a doctor. Amarlo, the doctor says to him, come to me, I'll break it, and I'll fix it for you. So that you know that I do a good job on breaking things. Okay, so that's what you're doing. You're basically saying, oh, I'm so sorry to hear about the loss of your father, your mother. You must be feeling miserable. You're like raising wounds you're basically opening wounds that have already been closed. So don't do it after 12 months. Now, again, what's the problem here? This was 12 months, and the other source said, don't do this after 30 days. So how do we resolve this? This is a very easy resolution for people who know laws of Avelut. Lo kashi haba aviv ve'imo. Father and mother, we go till 12 months generally. Habashar krovim, other relatives are only 30 days. So that's why the first source was talking about relatives. The other one was talking about your parents. Hatam nami. But then if we're just saying that's the only distinction, what was missing in the first Braita? It didn't say anything about, well, don't speak tanchumim, but you can ledaber min hatzad. You can allude to it. That's okay. So why doesn't it say that in the 30-day one? To which they say, they did mean that. They just didn't say it. Okay, but they meant it. What does it mean? Don't start opening it up again with him or her. That means kidarko in a normal way. After 30 days, you can start talking minatzad. You can mention it, without really, some people say it's without referencing the name of the person who died or specifically who died, getting kind of around it. Okay, last source for today. Now we get to a whole different thing, which is if you show up after the burial and people have already started sitting Shiva, do you count with them? Let's say you're a day late. Do you count with them or do you do your own count? So it depends how far away you were in the sense of, could you have gotten there in time even if you didn't? Tanu Rabbanan, if you come within the first 3 days, if you were close by and you theoretically could have gotten word on time, then monei mahen, then you go with them. Bami makom rachok, where you couldn't have found out in time because it was too far away. Again, this is irrelevant nowadays. But monela atzmo, then you do your own count because you couldn't have been there on time. So therefore, your Shiva counts from whenever you show up there. Mikam ve'elach, after the first 3 days, afilu bami makom karov monela atzmo. If you miss the first 3 days, then you have to start from the beginning. Rabbi Shimon Omer, he disagrees. He says, afilu ba b'yom hashvi'i mimakom karov monei mahen. Even if you show up on day number 7, if you're mimakom karov, you count with them and you basically sit Shiva 1 day. Amar Mar, so now they go into depth into one line. Shlosha yamim harishonim ba mimakom karov monei mahen. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, v'hu sheyesh gadol habayit babayit. This is only if you go with them, in which case, if the main person in the family is in the house. It basically, what they're saying is Shiva goes by the main person. Let's say you're the main person, but you happen to show up late, then you have to do your own count. But if the main person was in the house, then you go with them basically and you follow them. But if it wasn't, like let's say there, again, what you define by main, is it only the main person or a bunch of the people? It's unclear exactly how we define this, but there has to be some solid base in the house and then you can go by them. Otherwise, you have to go by your own count. With that, we'll finish for today. Have a great day, everybody. And Chodesh Tov.